Thank you. That's very helpful. I wondered if we could just sort of set the scene about how migrant women, and I want to deal with that as well, because I want to be clear that domestic abuse is gendered, isn't it? And the vast majority of the people we're talking about are women. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yes, okay. So I think that's quite important that we say that. But could both of you just kind of set the scene for who these women, mainly women, are, what happens to them if they are suffering from domestic abuse? What's the kind of the picture that we need to be made aware of, and the gaps in the services that you're trying to fill? So perhaps if you could start, Nicole, that would be helpful.
Sure. Well, I suppose when we say migrant victims of domestic abuse, as you say, we are often talking about women, although of course there are men who are victims of domestic abuse, and I do consider that part and parcel of my role as Domestic Abuse Commissioner to represent all victims of domestic abuse, or give them a voice. And not represent them or feel I could possibly myself. But for migrant survivors, particularly, we're talking about a people with a range of different status. So it's a kind of a catch-all, but it could be a student, it could be someone who is here on a spousal visa, it could be someone who is here visiting family. There's a range of people that we will see, and Vicky, I'm sure, will tell you in much more detail, that would find themselves in a situation where they either have no recourse to public funds, and what that means, it doesn't mean they couldn't go to a domestic abuse service. It means that the options that are available for that service will be very limited. So, as Vicky said, particularly not having recourse to public funds because of an immigration status really affects, obviously, your housing option. So refuge becomes a very difficult option to access. But a whole host of other things. So when I was a frontline worker, it was very difficult. Anyone who came with their children to my office said they weren't safe to go home. It was very difficult to think about what are the options right now that would help them, because nothing unlocks. It's challenging in normal circumstances, but unlocking what the options could be become very, very difficult. On top of that, you have immigration abuse. So in other words, the perpetrator, who often is a British citizen, we have to point out, will be giving false information to that victim, will be withholding information, will be purposefully doing things that would keep control of that victim. So there's an awful lot of abuse that takes place where victims will come forward after years, maybe to a health professional, for example, or someone who they may have very slowly been able to get to know, maybe the police, in an emergency, and they will have all sorts of misconceptions about what will happen to them, what will happen to their children, so many fears that are real and fears that have been imposed by the perpetrator, where there's not an ability to kind of understand what's correct about what's been told to them and what's not. A third issue is that lack of the buy-in for provision. So provision like Safety4Sisters, which I've had the pleasure of visiting, and I can tell you it was one of the most inspirational days I've had as commissioner. The extraordinary work that Vicky and her team do. That is a very rare provision. I mean, it is what Vicky does and her team does not exist in most areas of England and Wales. It's quite unusual, which is why I wanted to see it so badly. And so the options of seeking support are very, very limited. And when you do have, and this is my fourth and last point, and I'll hand over to you, Vicky, is a lot of times people who are interacting with services, whether it's domestic abuse services more generally, a housing officer, a GP, a social worker, if they even get that far to disclose or that domestic abuse is identified, that person's understanding of what options are available can be quite limited. And what we see in the very, some of the facts and figures that we do have is how often victims are told they don't have options when they actually do. So, for example, if they're on a spousal visa, there are options. People of all sorts of frontline services misunderstand and misinform the victim. So there's just layers upon layers of obstacles for migrant victims. And the good news is, I think we can solve them, and that's why I'm really pleased to be here and talking to you today. I think there is a will and an ability to solve these problems. So,
just before Vicky comes in, I just want to check with you. The issue around no recourse to public funds, people not being eligible to apply for those, is on the basis that when people come to this country on a visa, as a student, for example, they are supposed to have sufficient funds to support themselves. So that's the whole rationale behind no recourse to public funds, isn't it?
It is, and of course that's true, and that's right. But when you look at it through the lens of domestic abuse and our Domestic Abuse Act, which created my role, for example, the definition, now our legal definition of domestic abuse includes and understands the context of coercion and control, financial abuse. And so it's clear to all of us, I think, that even if someone once did have an ability to support themselves, once you add the controlling nature of domestic abuse, that is often out of their control. And so you find yourself destitute, you find yourself in situations that you weren't at all anticipating.
Yeah, thank you. Vicky?
Yeah, I would agree with everything Nicole has said. I think the barriers come when a woman is actually in the relationship and trying to leave, but also when she leaves that relationship. As Nicole has said, the abusers often use immigration as a control. So they abuse the woman and they say, if you go to the police, they'll take you to the Home Office, or you will be detained, deported. And often she doesn't know what her rights are, so she believes them. And the statistics bear out that migrant women stay longer in relationships and they don't leave until it becomes absolutely horrific and desperate. Because one thing they fear quite often, more than the violence of the man, is being deported, because when they go back to their home countries and they've left their husbands or their partners, they're in danger from his extended family and sometimes their own. So there's the fear keeps them there, and that's backed up and used by the abuser. The other point is that obviously there are no recourse to public funds, more than often dependent on the partner financially, and they know if they leave they'll have absolutely no income, so they're facing destitution and homelessness, and that is enough to keep, as it would for any of us, to keep them from actually leaving. And then the hostile environment within the community kind of backs that up, that they know if they leave, the likelihood is whether they sound or look like a migrant, they're going to be picked up and asked for their ID. And this is the sort of environment if they leave, they would come out of maybe a community that is surveillancing them as a woman in that relationship, but also is their support. So there's a lot of decisions they have to make, and they have to be extremely courageous to leave that violence, as bad as it is. And unfortunately, what we found is through the women's experience that they've talked to us about and that we witness, is when they do leave, some of these barriers play out for real. So they go to the housing office and they say, sorry, no recourse, you don't qualify for homelessness services. So to give you some examples, some of the women that we've had referred into our service have been sleeping rough in parks. We've had a woman who was actually sleeping rough in a park, and she had a kidney problem. And so both the housing and the social services said, sorry, recourse, we can't help you. She was fleeing domestic abuse. So we went to, in our advocacy role, we went to social services, and shockingly, they said, well, the park's next to a 24-hour McDonald's and they've got toilets. So we did challenge them and we won, and eventually they put her up in accommodation. But this is the sort of thing that women are up against for services. And as Nicole said, quite often frontline services, housing, social services, sometimes the police, sometimes refugees, don't understand, and they think either all women are asylum seekers or they're all no recourse, and they tend to panic because it's immigration, and immigration is scary. Of the 196 women who rang us, and we have 2 part-time advocates, we're a very small team. We had 147 that refused refuge space last year. And we felt the reason that we set up the refuge and that we set up our services is we felt this was not acceptable. We've also had women turning to the police who've then been taken straight to the Home Office. We've had women being told, can you not, and in the pandemic, a woman was told, sorry, we can't move you out of the house by the police because of COVID. And the same woman was told by social services, can you not live in another part of the house? So it's a mixture of not understanding the women's rights, not having the resources to do something for the women because they can't get housing benefit to get her into safe accommodation. And they all play out. And I've had women said to me, I feel like I'm not worth anything. My life isn't worth, I'm not worth the safety. And they see it. They get moved from different social services across social services boundaries. And we had a woman who we put up in a bed and breakfast for a week while 2 different local authorities argued out whose responsibility she was. And she had a child.
Right, thank you very much.
Jesus Christ, that was just gut-wrenching to listen to. I listened to it before, I listened to it second time. That was just gut-wrenching. You know, feeling worthless. Good God.